maybe at first some sound. So some phonology, some phonemes. From phonemes, the morphemes are made of. After morphemes, we have some lexical units, and then we have some utterances. And all of this is perceived in the process of listening. But just listening will do nothing without understanding or comprehension of the sense of the oral message. So that's why the term perception is closely connected with its comprehension of the message and understanding, or understanding, it's better to say. If we speak about perception, we may say that this is, in Ukrainian, it can be called сприйняття, або ментальна обробка, або перцепція повідомлення. And it means that it's some kind of mental interpretation, в цьому контексті це ментальна обробка якраз, of physical sensation produced by the stimuli from the external world. Some scientists also say that perception, this is the recognition of language signs using interpreted sensations. In such a case, this is hearing. And this is the hearing of the phonic substance of the source language sign and the ability to find a substitute for this language sign in the target language. So while percepting, again, we need to understand or comprehend what we perceive. When we speak again about understanding and about finding the right equivalent, we usually take into consideration such things as understanding. This is so-called mental grasp or comprehension of the source language signs, тобто розуміння, which presumes that interpreter has some kind of knowledge of what the sign means, and also what the nature of the notion or the process that is denoted by its sign. So in simple words, it means what actually stands behind each of these signs. And then, in order to understand, he needs to know the sense or the meaning of each of the signs. But while interpreting, you can't just interpret only the word without its contexts. Then we understand the meaning of the word only in the context or in the particular text of the particular situation, or in other words, in particular discourse. And the sense of each word, the meaning of the word, can be different depending on the context it is used in, or depending on the subject field it's also used in. And that's why we may say that interpreter usually doesn't translate or use or render dictionary meanings of language signs, but selects it from a variety of the meanings, finding the sense in such a way which is appropriate in particular situation or for particular utterance, and in particular discourse. That's why the sense of the language is the meaning conveyed or selected from the range of meanings of a sign. It can be word, phrase, or even complete utterance, with a reference to the subject field of interpreting. And an interpreter, usually having comprehended the sentence of science and transforms them into the objects of the real world, and in such a way he creates in his mind the picture of the world that is reflected in the oral message. So we may also say that comprehension of the sense of the utterance that is perceived by the interpreter is the stage, the first stage, which triggers, тобто запускає the start of translation or interpretation. And if comprehension of the sense is inadequate, then operational memory, тобто операційна пам'ять of the interpreter becomes overloaded, вона стає перевантаженою. And then, in such a case, translation or interpretation is performed in a word-for-word mode, тобто починається переклад просто дослівний або послівний, which is, of course, far from being perfect. Next stage that comes after perception and understanding the sense, this is so-called inner speech. Inner speech, іншими словами, це внутрішнє промовляння. So in this process of perception and understanding the source language message, there is so-called mechanisms as the inner speech of the interpreter that functions unconsciously, subconsciously, тобто безсвідомо, and it is usually called some kind of intermediary language, тобто така міжмовна стадія. So intermediary language between the source language message and between the stage of rendering, тобто власне перекладу it into the target language. These mechanisms, as I have already said, is subconscious. And it usually takes place before the interpreter begins the real translation of the message into target language. But it is also called, this inner speech is also called translation як переклад of the source language message into the inner speech of the interpreter, тобто переклад повідомлення вихідною мовою на внутрішнє промовляння перекладача. Only after it, interpreter is able to render it in the target language. І лише після свого внутрішнього промовляння перекладач може його озвучувати вже мовою перекладу. In such a way, we may say that interpreter perceives source language message, then he unpacks, тобто розпаковує its sense by translating it from the source language message into the inner speech, тобто ніби розпаковує його це внутрішнє промовляння, власне, розуміння далі відбувається після цього. And then he is browsing through the set of synonyms, equivalents, choosing the appropriate one by selecting the necessary translation, transformation, so on, so far, and then express it in the target language or renders it in the target language. So this can be shown to you in the way of such a scheme about this way the interpretation takes place. So we have perception of the source language message. So it just the same is done while translating in written translation, because in such a way you also perceive, for example, written text, then you converse it into your inner speech, and after that understanding takes place, and only after that you begin to choose the right equivalent or option in the target language, and then you render it in the target language. Це зрозуміло, чи треба пояснити ще раз? Спочатку відбувається сприйняття
певною мірою.
фіналу, так? Далі ми його розпаковуємо, перетворюємо у внутрішнє промовляння. Таким чином відбувається розуміння саме цього смислу, і після цього ми обираємо необхідні еквіваленти, синоніми, і продумуємо, це відбувається у долі секунди, необхідні трансформації перекладацькі, і, власне, озвучуємо текст або пишемо його іноземною мовою. So I would like to show you the example that is given in your book. But anyway, so imagine that you listen to such a passage. You are to interpret it. І все ж змушений зазначити, що у висновках шановних доповідачів та в резолюції і рекомендаціях відчувається певна незбалансованість у позитивах і негативах. Останнім надається, як на мене, перевага за рахунок перших. Яким чином відбувається це внутрішнє промовляння або розпакування сенсу інформації, яка тут заложена? Що доповідач змушений зазначити, що у висновках доповідачів щодо резолюції і рекомендаціях, ну, знаючи контекст, в якому він це перекладає, він розуміє, що це висновки і рекомендації асамблеї, є певний брак між позитивними і негативними оцінками. Оцінками чого? З контексту він розуміє ситуацію, яка відбувається зараз в Україні. І негативні оцінки переважають над позитивними. Тобто таким чином перекладач розпакував зміст цього повідомлення і, власне, оригінальний переклад перекладача цього уривку. And I still have no underscore that there is a certain imbalance between positive and negative assessments of the situation in Ukraine in the conclusion by highly estimated reporters and the resolution and recommendations of the Assembly. To my mind, negative assessments prevail over the positive ones. So this is just an example how it works. There is so-called question if interpreting is possible without understanding the sense. Of course, it's impossible for the interpreter to be some kind of an expert in all the spheres or fields of science, so on and so far, and to understand the sense in such a way, I mean so deeply as some kind of specialist or experts can do. The interpreter is usually impossible. He may have at least some kind of a knowledge and maybe of some of the process that involved, but maybe he is not such an expert. But for interpreter, it is important to know the terms and their equivalents or subjectual words and their equivalents in the target language, and then it makes possible for him or for her to interpret the message. So it means that interpretation without deep understanding of the sense can be possible. But anyway, interpreter has to develop and enhance his thesaurus. This is a long-term memory which is capable to store a great amount of information in different subject fields. In such a way, usually scientists say that practical experience show that successful interpretation is possible even if the interpreter has no understanding of the nature of the denotatum. Denotatum – це денотат, тобто це коли ми розуміємо значення слова з контексту, тобто це поняття, яке відображає певне явище або певний об'єкт з матеріального світу або взагалі зі світу. It means, for example, that he doesn't exactly know what stands behind a certain technical word, for example, or behind some kind of specific phrase. But such translation can be achieved under three conditions. The first is this is correct perception of the language sign by the interpreter. First of all, beginning with at the phonetic level. The second, this is having the meaning, not even obligatory the sense of the target language sign, and its source language equivalent in the operational memory. Тобто він має мати в операційній пам'яті цей термін і швидко викликати його еквівалент мовою, як мовою перекладу, так і мовою оригіналу. This is some scientists say that it's so-called personal mental glossary of the interpreter. And the third condition is if the source language text is not overloaded with some kind of professional science, slang, jargons, which can be understood only by limited group of specialists. So in such a case, the interpretation without deep understanding of the sense is possible. And you know maybe from our previous year that many subject field words and terms, they are internationalisms and they are often borrowed from Latin, ancient Greek, and have a similar pronunciation in the languages and have the similar meaning. So for the interpreter, again, it's important to enhance his or her thesaurus. And when we speak about this thesaurus, this information that is stored in the interpreter's memory, it can be the information of two types. At first, this is the information that is perceived and become understood. In such case, the interpreter has more or less deep insight into the nature of the denotator. And the second, this is when information which is perceived and recorded in the memory, for example, in the form of certain target language science or their source language equivalents, without profound understanding of their nature. So these are two types of this information. And that's why it's very useful for the interpreter to keep their personal field, subject field glossaries and to enhance them, to update them regularly, especially after their interpretation sessions, if they have them. So these are just the main points that should be discussed today. Do you have any questions or something else? Maybe you need more information to be explained, then you may ask me.
So can we prepare before the event like 100%? Or it is impossible?
It's impossible to be 100% prepared because no one knows what can happen.
Okay, so the main idea is you prepare somehow, then go participate, and afterwards you study the things you
So
are
you
short
study
of
things,
knowledge.
it's better to come back to all new things, especially new vocabulary that you come across, and maybe study it, make glossary, because interpretation, this is the skills that can be developed only through practice. No one knows what kind of situation you are going to be. Of course, it's good if you work for specific kind of company or firm, and you have definite subject field, you have glossary, and you work with it. But it's unfortunately not always possible. When you work as a conference interpreter, usually simultaneous interpreter, because conference interpreters, they are simultaneous interpreters, and you are interpreting at the specific events, of course, you have so-called glossaries of terms that are given to you by the organizers. And if it's some kind of a conference, and the reporters prepare their speeches in advance, they also give some kind of short abstracts of their speeches, and then interpreters are also provided with them. But it's not always. Besides, there are lots of situations when the speaker just starts speaking about something else, what is not written in his notes, and sometimes he gives some kind of examples, providing examples from literature, from Bible, reciting some poems, and so on so far. Of course, each time it makes lots of difficulties for the interpreter, and I usually say you have to викручуватися на місці.
But don't the speaker should understand the position of interpreters? Like
the speakers usually don't understand it. Not all speakers are. There is such a phrase as interpreter-friendly speaker. Тобто це той спікер, який зважає на перекладача. Usually when we have so-called high meetings such as summit, something like that, that usually involve some kind of international organizations to be included in, such as the United Nations organizations. So the speakers usually try to speak not too fast. So they take into consideration that they are interpreted simultaneously at the same time. Once there was some kind of case with me, when I was, it was some kind of excursion at school. And now I understand why teachers from school asked me to come with our class, with my daughter's class. And we went there, and as an accused, there were 2 Americans that were volunteers that worked at our school, at my daughter's school. And in such a way, our authorities, administration, school administration decided that I will interpret them the whole excursion. And for 3 hours of excursion, I was whispering, so interpreting simultaneously, but in so-called whisper mode. Of course, I was unprepared. I even couldn't imagine that something like that may happen. Anyway, it was there were such cases when also the guides that told us something during this excursion. They cited some poems and something like that, and I just told them that this is a poem by famous Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko, and it tells us about the fight for independence of Ukrainian peasants, something like that. Of course, I can't recite this in English, well, but it was such a difficult, unexpected, and totally unprepared experience. So besides there were teachers, school teachers of English, some with these excursions, and no one, of course, could interpret anything.
Do you usually use some tools like Google Translate or something else?
While
your smartphone?
Orally, of course, if it is such a possibility, but not always, because while translating, while interpreting, of course, you don't have the possibility. And the main problem here is to keep in memory all the information that you perceived, and not to forget, because if you just begin searching for something, you waste time and the information just fades away from your memory. That's why I usually don't do it. And if I don't know some words, or I'm not sure that I have understood everything correctly, I try to say it in a much more simpler way and condense the information then. What else? As for this, I always use notes. As for me now, I may say you that simultaneous interpretation is much easier than consecutive, especially if you work in particular sphere, in particular subject field. And it's much more prepared, can be much more prepared than consecutive. And you don't need to keep in memory such a big amounts of information. But with simultaneous interpretation, as for me, now I try not to do it only in some specific cases, because I have a very terrible headaches after interpreting simultaneously, and high blood pressure. These are my just health problems, and for me, after it, so I just feel that. So terrible headaches. This is
it true that
what
majority? Is it true that majority of oral translators, interpreters, they end up being like written translators?
You see, nowadays I know lots of interpreters that work both and as translators and interpreters, because if you need to earn money and you don't have an offer to do something orally, so you have nothing to do but to do some written translation as well.
Yeah, but it's like when you're growing older, it's like harder to deal with this stress, and a lot of people.
It's much more harder to deal with the stress and to relax. This mental pressure, this physical pressure while interpreting simultaneously, it's really rather great. And besides simultaneous interpretation, consecutive in it's also, but not maybe in so not so much as simultaneous, need practice. If we take as an example musicians or some kind of athletes, they need practice every day. If you don't practice simultaneous interpretation, particularly every day when you are not involved in this, when you, for example, don't have some kind of offers or orders for simultaneous interpretation, so then you will lose all your skills. You are to practice every day. So in such a way, even if you don't have simultaneous interpretation today, you are to choose some kind of a speech, play it for yourself, and see it and interpret it simultaneously. Without this, you then won't have the proper speed of finding, of giving equivalence, and besides, very often my students say that we understand everything, but we can't say it in a good way, for example, in Ukrainian or in Russian. So the main difficulty is here to say it in a good way, not only just understand, but to be able to express it in a good way by the means of the target language, to sound naturally, to sound good. And this is, of course, the difficulty. Of course, you understand, but when you don't do it simultaneously and don't practice, don't train yourself, so you won't get any result. But in general, if you ask any interpreter, they will tell you that simultaneous interpretation is easier than consecutive. Besides, when you work simultaneously, you don't work alone. You work at least in pair. Usually in European and for example, European interpreters, they even work in the group of 3. Our interpreters, to earn more, usually work in pairs. So one is interpreting, another is sitting next and helps the partner with some kind of difficulties, taking notes and to cope with different situations. Usually when we work in 3, we have 15 minutes. For 15 minutes, when working in pairs, usually 20-30 minutes, but 30 minutes, it's even too long, I would say. So 15-20 minutes is simultaneously, it's okay. Then you begin to lose your pace, speed, and there is something that may like log you or something like that. You are overloaded.
Okay, if you work in pair with your partner, you are primary and he or she is backup. What's the role of primary and backup in case if, for example, primary don't know what is it?
So, at first they exchange, and while sitting as a back, so he helps with some difficulties, very quickly tries to find if there is something that how to say it, if some difficulties arise with some vocabulary, some names of organizations or something that goes wrong, so the helper, so-called, tries to do everything to help, to search for, to find the name of the organization or something like that. Usually, or in many cases, if it's a professional conference interpretation, it's very often done with a written script. If it is organized in a good way, and then it's also much easier. Of course, not all the scripts are given you beforehand. Of course, it would be better and it should be so, but not always it is done in such a way. But if you have it beforehand, so it's much more easy, because you may look through and find some difficulties. Besides, simultaneous interpreters, they prepare for the events. First of all, they usually prepare with all the participants who are going to take part in it, and they through the they have to look through all their names and to know how to pronounce them correctly in both languages. Maybe some kind of pose or positions of these participants. Also, all the organizations involved. Then organizers always give their glossaries, so the terms. So you get prepared, I mean, with what is going to be discussed during it and what it involves. So you are in such a way in any context. If you have the opportunity, it's better even to look through, if it's some kind of scientific conference, to look through some of the works or maybe some research papers of the participants who are going to take part in. As for me, as for conference, there was an experience in most cases of so-called, again, whispering interpretation, because so I just accompany the British and American scientists that were attending the conferences in Ukraine, and I usually interpret them in a whispering mode, and it is much more difficult while being isolated in the booth, and you have someone who can help you while you are being for 4 hours next to them. And that is usually without stop. But maybe in such a way you again give just general idea of what has been said. Of course, a great difference for an interpreter than if you accompany someone then to be at some kind of official lunches or something like that. There is informal conversation, discussion, and usually some kind of jokes or anecdotes. So of course these are difficulties, and for others are eating and you are speaking and interpreting. It's not a good way, especially if you have been working for the whole day. So it's rather difficult. Well, I think that we are to proceed to practice now. And for today, we are to finish the text about computer viruses, to practice your interpreter skills, and then we are to take another text about cybersecurity. Am I right?
Yeah.
So then. We start with viruses. Which one we have done? I don't remember. I have written the minutes, but I'm not sure if I have it in these notes now. Just a moment. Do you remember at what place have we stopped?
На вірусі I love you это 100%.
Ага.
Але
Мабуть, третій закінчили. Ми на 4-му маємо бути.
На 4-му вірусі. It's okay, thank you. Well, at first, while I'm downloading it for you, please, who would like to continue computer viruses?
May I?
To interpret
Так, let's take those who didn't answer the previous lesson. So for me, to ask some who didn't manage to answer before. Так, значить, у нас Саша, бачу. Так, далі за Сашою хто бажає? Піднімайте ручки, будь ласка, добре? Віка, угу. Аліна, окей, вау. Так, зараз включаю демонстрацію.
The same worm. The worm spread faster than any other virus ever had, infecting 7. Mess could have been prevented, though. Stalled it yet. The 2007 storm worm was a.
So, Sasha, I think we may start.
Okay, so should I translate
So just I will play
the
it.
passage I have just
No,
heard?
no, just
Ah,
I just
okay,
play
okay.
from here.
Another worm that spread through email, but its purpose wasn't to destroy your computer or information. It wanted to take over your computer instead. The original subject.
Значить, це ще один вірус по типу черв'як, який заражав комп'ютер, але в цього віруса була ціль не знищити ваш комп'ютер, а взяти його під контроль.
Line read 230 dead as storm batters Europe, which is where the virus gets its name. But instead of an attachment, the email contained a link to a website, which promptly downloaded the virus onto the user's machine. And then.
Значить, люди отримували лист у своїй поштовій скриньки з текстом по типу 230 людей постраждалих від шторму в Європі. І коли вони натискали на посилання в листі, вони приходили на сайт, де, власне, вірус і завантажувався.
Так, зараз хвилинку, він тут щось пише звук. А, мабуть, треба запис закінчити, бо буде зараз вибивати нам звук. Хто у нас там записував? Саша, по-моєму, так, то треба припинити запис.
Да, я виключу зараз.
Ага.